December 20th, 1943. The skies over war-torn Germany are a frozen, merciless battlefield. A German fighter pilot, his Messerschmitt Bf-109, a predator of the air, pulls alongside a crippled American B-17 bomber. Inside the bomber, which is more whole than airplane, the American crew can see him clearly through their shattered windows. He is close enough to see the terror in their eyes. And he, in turn, can see them. He can see the wounded, the desperate, the young men fighting a losing battle just to stay airborne. One short burst from his cannons would tear them apart. It would be over in seconds. His finger rests on the trigger. He's a veteran, an ace with 22 confirmed kills. One more, just one more, would earn him the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest and most coveted military honor, a hero's medal. Instead, Second Lieutenant Franz Stigler made a decision that, by all rights, should have gotten him put up against a wall and shot. He chose to save them. Now, to understand the weight of that choice, you need to understand the man who made it. Franz Stigler was no reluctant warrior. He wasn't a secret pacifist or a man questioning his cause. He was a professional fighter pilot, and a damn good one. Born in Bavaria in 1915, Stigler grew up with the roar of engines in his ears. His father and uncle were pilots in the First World War. Flying wasn't just a job, it was in his blood. By the time the Second World War ignited across Europe, he had already logged thousands of hours as a civilian pilot and flight instructor. He was a master of the sky before he ever flew in combat. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1940 and was trained by the best. His instructors were Germany's top aces, legends of the air. One of them, an officer named Gustav Rodel, taught Stigler more than just how to fight. He taught him how to fight with honor. Rodel's words were etched into Stigler's mind. You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by the rules to keep your humanity. By December 1943, Stigler had proven himself again and again. He'd flown harrowing missions over North Africa, Sicily, and Italy before being transferred back home to defend the fatherland itself. He'd been shot down and survived. He had sent 22 Allied planes spiraling to the earth. At 28 years old, he was experienced, lethal, and exactly the kind of pilot the Luftwaffe desperately needed as waves of American bombers hammered German cities day after day. But he was also the kind of pilot who remembered what Gustav Rodel had told him. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched a massive bombing raid against aircraft factories in Bremen, Germany. Among the hundreds of bombers was a B-17 named Olde Pub, piloted by a 21-year-old second lieutenant named Charlie Brown. It was his very first combat mission as the aircraft commander. The mission went wrong from the very beginning. Almost immediately, German fighters tore into their formation with savage efficiency. Olde Pub was riddled with cannon fire. The number 2 engine was completely destroyed. The number 4 engine was hit, damaged, and bleeding oil. The electrical system was failing, the hydraulics were gone. Most critically, the oxygen system was shot out. At 27,000 feet, this was a death sentence. The crew began to suffer from hypoxia, their minds and bodies starving for air, their movements becoming slow and clumsy. And then it got worse. A direct hit from a cannon shell killed the tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, instantly. Multiple other crew members were wounded by shrapnel. The bomber's plexiglass nose was completely shattered, exposing the bombardier and navigator to a paralyzing sub-zero wind. The tail section was so mangled, the entire rear gunner's position was nearly torn from the fuselage. There were holes in the plane's body large enough for a man to crawl through. Somehow, through sheer force of will, Charlie Brown managed to drop his bombs on the target and turn the crippled bomber back toward England. But in the process, Olde Pub had fallen out of formation. In the air war over Germany, a lone bomber was a dead bomber. It was the law of the jungle. German fighters swarmed isolated, damaged aircraft like sharks to blood in the water. Olde Pub limped along at barely 2,000 feet, a dangerously low altitude, desperately trying to reach the relative safety of the North Sea. The crew knew more fighters would come. They were out of the fight. They had almost no ammunition left. Several of their defensive machine guns had been destroyed. They were, for all intents and purposes, defenseless. On the ground at a nearby airfield, Franz Stigler had just landed his Messerschmitt to refuel and rearm. He had already been in the thick of the fight that morning. As he sat in his cockpit, waiting, a ground crewman shouted and pointed to the sky. There it was. An American B-17 flying right past their airfield at an impossibly low altitude. It was a gift. Easy prey. Stigler didn't hesitate. He took off immediately. This would be simple. The bomber was crippled, it was alone, it was flying low and slow. His Bf-109 was faster, more maneuverable, and armed to the teeth. He closed the distance in moments, moving into the perfect attack position right on the bomber's tail. This was it, his 23rd kill, the one that would earn him the Knight's Cross. He pulled up alongside the bomber to verify it was an American plane and choose his point of attack. This was standard procedure. Get a good look, then open fire. But what he saw stopped him dead. Through the massive, gaping holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see inside the bomber. He could see the crew, frantic and terrified. He could see the tail gunner, slumped over in his position, his uniform soaked in blood, clearly dead. He saw other crew members, wounded, struggling to help each other, to keep their broken machine in the air. He looked at the tail section, shredded and twisted, and he couldn't comprehend how it was still attached to the rest of the plane. The entire aircraft looked like it had been put through a meat grinder. Stigler eased his fighter forward until he was level with the cockpit. He saw the pilot, Charlie Brown, wrestling with the controls, his face a mask of exhaustion and grim determination. The young American pilot looked over and saw him. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, their eyes met, a German ace and an American rookie, locked in a silent gaze. And in that instant, Franz Stigler thought about Gustav Rodel's words, "You fight by the rules to keep your humanity." He realized that what he was looking at wasn't an enemy war machine anymore. It was a flying coffin filled with dying men. Shooting them down wouldn't be combat. It wouldn't be an act of war. It would be murder. The code of honor that had been drilled into him had a simple, unwritten rule. You don't shoot a man in a parachute. Why? Because he's defenseless. He's no longer a threat. He is entitled to the chance to survive. Stigler looked at the men in that shattered B-17. They were no different. They were as helpless as a man dangling from a silk parachute. The bomber could barely fly. It couldn't fight back. It was already beaten. Franz Stigler made his decision. He pulled his fighter into a tight formation alongside the B-17's right wing, so close that the American crew could see every detail of his plane, every rivet, and the pilot staring back at them. Inside Olde Pub, pure panic erupted. A German fighter was on their wing, ready to deliver the killing blow. They waited for the flash of the guns. What was left of the crew tried to man the damaged machine guns, but they had almost no ammunition left, and the guns were barely functional anyway. They were sitting ducks. But the German pilot didn't shoot. Instead, he raised his hand and waved. He gestured at them, then pointed down toward Germany, trying to signal that they should land at a German airfield. He was offering them their lives. Charlie Brown and his crew refused. They shook their heads and kept flying stubbornly toward England. Stigler understood. Landing in Germany meant becoming prisoners of war. They would rather risk death in a failing airplane over the icy North Sea than spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire. What Stigler did next was even more astonishing. It was an act that defied all logic, all orders, and all sense of self-preservation. He moved his fighter into a protective position, flying slightly ahead and to the side of the American bomber, making himself clearly visible to anyone watching from the ground. His presence now served a chilling and brilliant purpose. German anti-aircraft batteries, known as flak, were positioned all along the coast. They were trained to fire on any Allied aircraft that came within range, without question. But the gunners on the ground now saw a baffling sight. A crippled American bomber flying in perfect close formation with a German Messerschmitt. They held their fire. They couldn't be sure what they were seeing. Was it a captured American plane being escorted to a German base? Was it some kind of strange training exercise? The confusion was enough. No one fired a shot. Franz Stigler was using his own aircraft as a shield to protect his enemy from his own countrymen. They flew like this for several long, agonizing minutes, crossing the German coastline and heading out over the North Sea. Stigler knew that every second he stayed with them was another second he risked being seen by another German pilot, or being reported by his superiors. If anyone in the Luftwaffe found out that he had deliberately let an enemy bomber escape, worse, that he had actively helped it escape, he would face a court-martial. The penalty for treason was execution. Finally, over the open sea, at the absolute limit of his fuel range, Stigler pulled in close one last time. He looked across the void at Charlie Brown in the cockpit. He raised his hand to his helmet and gave a crisp, formal military salute, one pilot to another. Then he peeled his fighter away, turned back toward Germany, and vanished. Charlie Brown and his crew watched him go, completely stunned. They couldn't begin to process what had just happened. An enemy pilot, the man who held their lives in his hands, had just saved them. Against all odds, Ye Olde Pub made it across the North Sea. The mangled bomber landed at an emergency airfield on the British coast, practically falling out of the sky. When the ground crew saw the extent of the damage, they were speechless. They couldn't believe the aircraft had stayed in the air for another 10 minutes, let alone another 2 hours. The bomber was so badly damaged, it was immediately scrapped for parts. It would never fly again, but every surviving member of its crew made it home. Franz Stigler returned to his base. He climbed out of his cockpit and said nothing. He never reported the encounter. He never told another soul in the Luftwaffe what he had done. It was far too dangerous. In the eyes of his command, helping an enemy wasn't an act of mercy. It was treason. He continued to fly combat missions until the very end of the war. He survived, surrendered to American forces, and in 1953 immigrated to Canada, where he built a new life and became a successful businessman. Charlie Brown also survived the war. He returned to the United States, served in the Air Force for decades, and lived a quiet life. But neither man could ever forget what happened on that frozen December day over Germany. Charlie Brown carried the memory of the mysterious German pilot who had shown him an impossible mercy. Upon his return, he told his crew never to speak of it. He was worried that if the U.S. military found out they had been spared by an enemy pilot, there would be uncomfortable questions, accusations of cowardice, or even collaboration. So, for their own protection, they stayed silent. Franz Stigler carried the memory too, a secret that could have cost him his life. He had violated his direct orders and risked everything to save men he was supposed to kill. He couldn't talk about it either. For more than 40 years, both men kept the secret locked away. Then, in 1986, an older Charlie Brown decided he had to try. He had to find the pilot who saved his life. He published a small notice in a Combat Pilot Association newsletter describing the encounter in detail and asking a simple question: does anyone know who this Luftwaffe pilot might have been? The newsletter made its way across the world, and eventually a copy of it reached a retired businessman living in Vancouver, Canada. It reached Franz Stigler. In 1990, the two men met, for the first time on the ground. For the first time since their eyes had locked across the sky in 1943. Charlie Brown was 68 years old. Franz Stigler was 75. They looked at each other, and in an instant they knew. Franz confirmed every single detail of Charlie's story. He explained his decision, the code of honor, the memory of Gustav Rodel's teachings, the shocking sight of the wounded crew. He confessed that he had carried a heavy weight of guilt for 47 years, not for sparing them, but for all the other planes he had shot down. The encounter with Ye Olde Pub, he said, was a stark reminder that his enemies were human beings, not just targets on a list.
The two men became the closest of friends. They spent their remaining years together, appearing at air shows, telling their incredible story to new generations, and talking on the phone every single week. Charlie Brown often said that Franz Stigler was like a brother to him. Franz Stigler died in 2008 at the age of 92. Charlie Brown died just 8 months later at the age of 87. Before he passed, Franz told an interviewer that sparing Charlie Brown's crew was the single best and most important thing he had ever done in his entire life. His decision that day wasn't about politics or ideology. It was about something far simpler and far more profound. It was about the recognition of a shared humanity found in the most inhuman of places. In the middle of a total war, he risked disgrace and execution to spare 10 men he had never met and whom he never expected to see again. He gained nothing from it. In fact, it cost him. He never got his Knight's Cross. He never got the official recognition that his military culture valued above all else. But he kept his humanity. He followed the code he had been taught, even when it contradicted his orders, even when it put his own life on the line. The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown reveals a hidden truth about the warriors of the sky. Despite being on opposite sides, despite the propaganda and the visceral hatred of the war, many pilots maintained a code of conduct rooted in a strange and powerful mutual respect. They saw themselves as knights of a modern age, as warriors, not as murderers. There were rules, unwritten but deeply understood. Their friendship, forged decades after the war, proved that the humanity they recognized in each other that day was real and it was lasting. It suggests that their true enemies weren't the men in the other airplanes. Their enemy was the war itself, the circumstances that had forced them into the sky to kill each other in the first place. What Franz Stigler did was simple. He looked at his enemy and he saw a human being in trouble. He chose mercy over medals. He chose compassion over orders. And that one choice in a frozen sky over Germany came to define the rest of both their lives.